My name is Chris, though you might recognize my voice from another channel called Stoehovve, where I do various tutorials for Fantasy Grounds Unity. In this collaboration with Smiteworks, I will be updating the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Player's Handbook walkthrough to bring it in line with the rest of the walkthroughs that have already been recorded or are planned to be recorded. The Player's Handbook is the primary source of information for players in the 5th edition rule set for Dungeons & Dragons. It is this module that contains all of the basic racial, class, and background data, as well as the various spells and equipment that were published when 5th edition was released. It also explains the basic rules used for ability scores, what they apply to, how adventuring in general will work, as well as covers the various rules around combat specific to actions, movement, and bonus actions, and other aspects that have the potential to come into play during a combat encounter. As a result of this video has been recorded with players in mind, though Dungeon Masters will still enjoy this video as you'll be able to point your players towards this particular video so that they can become more familiar with this module. I should point out, however, that I am making the assumption that you've already created an account on the Fantasy Grounds website, obtained your license, and installed and linked Fantasy Grounds Unity to your account. If you have completed none of these steps, I highly recommend you take a quick look at part 1 of the Quick Start Guide before continuing on with the rest of this video. I will also provide a link to that video in the description below so that you can quickly access it. If you already own the module, you may skip this section of the video as we will be covering where the module can be purchased from. As a player, you don't need to purchase this module because the Dungeon Master's campaign server is going to provide it to you in a way that allows you to view its contents while you're connected to that campaign server. However, it doesn't hurt if you do purchase the module, and it does help both Smiteworks and the Wizards of the Coast if you do so, because it's showing your support for the Dungeons & Dragons community. There are going to be 2 locations where you can purchase the Player's Handbook for Fantasy Grounds Unity, and they are the Fantasy Grounds online store as well as the Steam Marketplace. I will provide links directly to the Player's Handbook for both locations in the description below, as well as provide links to the bundles that they are actually included in. In relation to a purchase made from the Steam Marketplace, there will be an extra step that is required to ensure that your Fantasy Grounds account can see that Steam purchase and be able to install the module the next time you attempt to update Fantasy Grounds Unity through the Fantasy Grounds Updater utility. The step in question is to ensure that your Fantasy Grounds and Steam accounts are linked to one another, and if you've not done this, I will provide a link to the wiki page that will walk you through this process for Fantasy Grounds Unity. The Player's Handbook has been designed so that it can be loaded by both the Dungeon Master and the players, though players will be the primary users of this particular module. As a Dungeon Master, you won't need to load this module, and this is because most of the information you need is going to be provided by the Dungeon Master's guide itself. However, I have found it is still quite useful to load this module as a Dungeon Master so that I can more easily find something I might be looking for in reference to a specific spell, piece of equipment, class, racial trait, or anything else that I might need. Additionally, because your system is going to be providing the Player's Handbook module to your players, you can go ahead and disable all of these SRD reference modules here because they will no longer be needed. And this is because the Player's Handbook contains all of the base elements that are part of the SRD data module, or at least portions of it that are specific to the players, as well as all of the non-SRD published content that makes up the full 5th edition rule set associated with the Player's Handbook. By disabling this green checkbox here, we are now preventing the players from being able to load this SRD module because they won't even be able to see it. To actually load the module, either as a DM or as a player, there are 2 separate options that you have that you can choose from. The first is through the campaign setup window that pops up whenever you go ahead and launch Fantasy Grounds Unity for the first time. When you go into the data modules page here, you will see that you have a number of options here for going ahead and loading up all of the various modules. On this particular data modules page, there are 3 buttons that are associated with being able to access and load up the Player's Handbook. And that is the Modules button, the 5th edition Core Rules button, as well as the 5th edition All Rules button. The first button simply takes you to the module activation page, with which you can go ahead and search for the Player's Handbook. Whoops, works better if I actually spell things right. And then you can go ahead and click this load button. I'm not going to do that because I want to be able to showcase some of the other options that you have. I will state, however, that this works both as a player and as a Dungeon Master. It doesn't matter which side of the session that you're involved in. Now, as a Dungeon Master, if you go ahead and click on this 5th edition Core Rules button, what's going to happen is that it's going to go ahead and load all of the modules that are associated with being classified as a core rule module. Once it's gone ahead and completed that process, you will see that it has loaded the Dungeon Master's Guide, the player's module associated with the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster's Manual, as well as the Player's Handbook. Also, as the Dungeon Master, if you go ahead and click on this 5e All Rules button, what's going to happen is it's going to load all of the 5th edition modules that you currently have available on your system. This includes supplemental modules, anything that can provide a campaign that has additional elements that are added, such as your new classes, new races, anything like that. It will not load campaign modules that don't have any of those things. So that is going to be the key difference in relation to that. But it also does include the Player's Handbook. Now, as a player, if you go ahead and click on the Core Rules button here, all it should do is load the Player's Handbook, which is all it has done. And that is simply because that is the only module that is classified as a quote-unquote core rule from a player's perspective associated with Fantasy Grounds Unity. But if you go ahead and click on the 5th edition All Rules button here, what's actually going to happen as a player is that it's going to go through and identify all of the supplemental modules that the Dungeon Master is allowing that are classified as player modules. And it's going to go ahead and load all of those for you. So it's a very quick, convenient way to gain access to all of the modules you may want to use at some point throughout the portion of this particular campaign. Now, as a Dungeon Master or as a player, there is another more manual method to go through and load all of these particular modules, specifically the Player's Handbook, as that's what we're covering in this video. You can go ahead and click on this library button here to drop down and gain access to the modules window. Clicking on activation will bring up all of the associated modules, and all you have to do is once again search for the Player's Handbook. Clicking on load will ensure that the module gets loaded on your system, and this works for both a player and a Dungeon Master. Now, the Player's Handbook module provides everything a player is going to need to create a character for use within Dungeons & Dragons. There are a number of panels that will contain important information that you might want to reference at some point, and they are as follows. Under the Character drop-down menu, you'll find the Backgrounds panel, which is going to go ahead and show you all of the character backgrounds that you can use when you're going through and creating your character. The next is going to be the Classes button, and this is going to provide you all of the base classes that you will be required to start off with one exception, the Artificer, in relation to your character creation. The Feats panel is going to contain all of the optional features that your DM may or may not allow for use within their campaign, and they will be generally applied at later levels, specifically as you're acquiring the ability to change or increase an ability score. However, feats can also come into play during character creation if you have some additional modules in play or playing by some of the rules introduced by Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. The Races panel is going to provide the initial set of character races that can be chosen in order to create your character. And this isn't by far a complete list of all of the available races within the Dungeons & Dragons canon at this point, but this is what was initially introduced when the Player's Handbook was released. The Skills panel is going to help explain all of the various skills that your character has. Things like acrobatics, stealth, and even performance skills are an example. And finally, there is the Spells panel, and this is going to be primarily used by those players who are creating spellcasting-based characters. However, while that covers the bulk of the elements that the Player's Handbook goes through and introduces, there are some other elements that are added as part of this campaign drop-down menu that you as a player might have to periodically access, but this area is primarily going to be used by the Dungeon Master. The Images panel is going to contain all of the images that were extracted during the conversion process when Smiteworks was adding this module to Fantasy Grounds. Generally, you would see these in the physical copy or in the PDF version of the Player's Handbook, so it doesn't make sense to not have them as part of the actual presentation within Fantasy Grounds. The Items panel is going to contain all of the things like weapons, armor, and other equipment and items that your character can go ahead and make use of, although most of these, if not all of these, will not necessarily be magical in nature, as those generally come from the various campaign modules or from the Dungeon Master Guide. The NPCs panel is going to be used for those character classes that are allowed to have some form of animal form or other kind of companion that is associated with any of these NPCs. There are some classes out there that allow you to have animal companions, for example, whereas the Druids allow you to shape change into various kinds of natural creatures. And finally, the Tables panel is going to contain all of the different random roll tables that you can use for inspiration to directly add details to your characters, such as ideals, flaws, or bonds, as well as other kinds of tables that are used for many different reasons. Now, all of these things are going to be accessible through the various buttons that you see here on the side, or directly through some of these links that you see here and within the actual reference guide, which is kind of like the equivalent of a PDF version of the actual player's handbook. Now, one of the more important panels is the classes listing panel, which is going to contain all of the information sheets specific to one or more classes you might be interested in for using for your character. With only a couple of exceptions, all of the base classes were introduced when the player's handbook itself was released, and it is these classes that are used as the root of pretty much all other class specializations that have been published within this module, as well as many of the other supplemental modules. And as I said, other classes have been introduced since the player's handbook has been published, but we're not going to be referencing them in this module because they're not really related to this particular grouping of classes. However, if you happen to have other modules loaded and simply want to narrow your listing down to those that are just provided by the player's handbook, all you have to do is click this group button down here and select the player's handbook from the list, and all you will see are all of the base classes that were introduced by the player's handbook. Now, each class has the ability to have one or more class specializations, and you will find those at the bottom of all of the various classes that you will have in this listing here. So for example, the Barbarian has Path of the Berserker and Path of the Totem Warrior. Those are your character's class specializations if you have selected Barbarian for your class. You will also find other bits of information in relation to how you go ahead and create this particular class. For example, there is a quick build that is generally provided on each of these class sheets so that you can go ahead and just quickly create a character if you're in a bit of a rush. Now, other elements are also provided by all of the various class sheets, including your starting abilities, which are found down here, their initial total hit points. Most of your starting equipment can be found from this list of equipment links that you have here, and other specific features that might include things like spell selections. Each information sheet is also going to contain details about what changes occur between level increases, which can include things like your proficiency adjustments, new features, when the class specialization is going to be obtained, what other elements that could be unique to that class, such as the Barbarian's number of rages per level, as well as the damage associated with those rages. In the case of spellcasters, you're going to have things like the number of spell slots that your character is going to have during those level increases. And if this is the first time that you're going through and trying to create a character, I highly recommend that you take a look through some of these different classes, review their descriptions, take a look at some of the features to see if it's something that you're going to enjoy playing, as there's really no point in playing something that you're not going to like. The backgrounds are very similar in purpose as the classes listing, in that it's going to provide you with all of the various backgrounds that were defined by the player's handbook. It too can be filtered down so that all you have to worry about looking at are those backgrounds that come directly from the player's handbook if you happen to have other modules loaded. And you're going to find that this filtering capability is going to be common across all of these panels. And once again, other backgrounds have been supplied by other modules, but the listing you're going to see in this particular video is going to be those specifically to the backgrounds that were published when 5th edition itself was published. Backgrounds are used to help you provide a framework of where your character came from and or what they did prior to becoming an adventurer. They also provide some additional starting equipment, such as your starting gold, for example, as well as a few additional features that can add further capabilities to your character. For the most part, a lot of the things that you will find here are meant to supplement your role-playing of your given character and guide you in relation to how that is going to work by defining their flaws, their bonds, and ideals, as well as their personality, giving you that framework to figuring out how to act as your character. Once again, you will want to review the various backgrounds and choose one that is the most suitable for what you think is going to reflect your character and what you have in mind for that character. The last choice you should make before starting the process of creating your character is defining their race, and the player's handbook provides a number of options for you to select from. The initial set of 10 races provided by the 5th edition rule set provide a wide range of options that you can select from, and even have some additional racial options that provide a little bit of variation to that given race. A good example of that is the Dragonborn race. It itself has a number of different capabilities depending on the draconic ancestry that you have selected for your particular Dragonborn character, if you're going to create one. And this is because your draconic ancestry is actually what chooses the type of breath weapon that you're going to go through and make use of in relation to your character, as well as what particular type of damage that you become resistant to once you have that capability. And over time, once you begin the process of playing maybe one or two different races, or even you've gone through the entire list, you're going to find that they tend to work best with specific kinds of characters in mind, specifically related to various classes. And this is usually because of the kinds of bonuses and ability score improvements that the race or your sub-race is going to be giving your character. But there's really no restriction on what race goes with what class. It only helps if you're looking to more or less min-max your character stats. The information sheet associated with each race is going to have a number of starting elements that you're going to want to look at, such as the ability score improvements that are going to occur when you've chosen this particular race, meaning that if you have a 16 on your die roll for your strength, for example, and you've chosen the Dragonborn race, then you're going to automatically gain a +2 increase to that strength stat. You'll also want to look at the age, your character size, the speed, any languages that your character starts off with, things like that. And they also provide some example naming conventions that you can choose from if you're running into a problem coming up with your own name and you really don't want to go to the internet to find some random name generator. It gives you a good starting point for both male names, female names, childhood starting names, and clan names, things like that. And you can mix and match as you see fit. I don't think there's really a restriction that a DM is going to apply in this day and age in relation to those names. Newer supplements also do allow you to mix and match these a little bit more flexibly, but the initial release of these races was not as flexible despite them being there and having the ability to provide a wide variety as they stand today. As the Player's Handbook was the first reference manual for players in 5th edition, it is also going to provide you with the initial grouping of spells that you might want to choose from in relation to your character, specifically if you're choosing a spellcaster or a class that eventually unlocks the means to cast spells. Now this panel is a little bit more complicated because you do gain the ability to filter by module, but you also gain the ability to filter by the level of the spell, whether it's a ritual as well as the source. Now in this case, the source means what class or what domain or specialization is it associated with. For example, I could go ahead and try to narrow down the listing of these spells to those provided by the Bard. And within this list, this is going to tell you that these spells, and only these spells, are going to be usable by the Bard. Other classes might also have the ability to use these spells, but this gives you a complete listing of any bardic spell that your character might be able to use if you have selected the Bard for your class. While it is easy to go ahead and search within this particular grouping for a specific spell, you got to know what the name of that spell is or what level or source that it has come from. I find it's actually easier just simply to go to the class associated with the character that I'm playing, scroll down till you find the spellcasting option here, and yes, you are going through a number of links to get there, but it's going to provide you a link directly to your class's specific spell table. And to me, I find this a little bit more useful simply because I know right away what my cantrips are. So if I go ahead and expand this out, I can see all of the cantrips that I can choose from in relation to my bardic class. I can also minimize that and automatically see what level 1 spells I have available to me and things like this. The catch is that this particular spellcasting reference is going to link you to a table that is specific to the Player's Handbook. So if you have, say, Tash's Cauldron of Everything or another module loaded, and that happens to introduce new spells for the Bard class, you're not going to find them there. You'll have a better luck finding them here, or you can go to that module's class sheet and pull up all of the associated spells within that particular module's spell table. This listing of spells is still useful though, and I find that once in a while if I'm looking at swapping one spell out for another because I have the ability to do so during a level increase or because Tash's Cauldron of Everything's features are giving me the ability to do so, I might come to this particular listing rather than going to the individual class sheet in order to find a spell that I'm looking for. The Player's Handbook also provides a number of optional features that can be added to your character over time. However, you will need to check with your Dungeon Master before choosing a feat, as some DMs are going to be hit or miss in relation to this, because some Dungeon Masters don't allow feats in their campaigns because they find them a little bit too overpowered, but other Dungeon Masters do. These are optional abilities, meaning that they are only going to be available to you at the time that your character is able to adjust ability scores. And as long as the Dungeon Master is allowing you to choose one in place of that ability score, then you'll be able to gain access to these feats. If your DM does allow feats, then adding them to your character is as simple as literally going ahead and choosing a player here. So I'm going to quickly load up a player. Let's use Bluebell. And all you have to do is drag and drop that feat from, say, here directly on to your character's information sheet. Now, this one's probably not useful for this character, but it's relatively easy to go ahead and add it. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, however, introduced a new way to go ahead and link a race to your character, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility with that. One of those capabilities is the means to add a feat to your character as part of that process. It also is going to be on the condition that it is applicable to your character, in that the race that you have gone ahead and created has the option to choose a feat during that character creation process. Within the player's handbook, there are a couple of classes where a character has the means to have a beast or animal companion, or actually turn into one. Druids, for example, are able to wild shape into a creature that falls within a specific challenge rating. And it's a little hard to do that if you always have to refer to the DM's guide or some other form of reference that introduces a creature your character can become, and it has to be shared by the Dungeon Master. As a result, the player's module will actually provide you with most of those creatures right in the NPC panel on the player side of things. Through this list, you can actually review what options exist and are available to you. Oops, I didn't actually want to select that. And then, when you're ready to actually go ahead and choose a particular beast, the Dungeon Master can create a copy of this particular character sheet or NPC sheet, and then share that over to you, and then you can then link it into your quick taskbar down here in order to be able to quickly gain access to it again. Beasts of burden or mounts are also found within this panel, with the mule, riding horse, and warhorse being some examples that you can find. The player's handbook is also the main source for much of your character's starting equipment, which can be made up of your armor, weapons, tools, musical instruments, and other items. And there are two main locations where you can find the equipment that you might be looking for once you've gone through the initial process of creating your character. The first is directly from the class's information sheet. So if I select the Barbarian, for example, and I go down into this particular weapons table, for instance, I can see all of the simple melee weapons, simple ranged weapons, the martial weapons, and the martial ranged weapons that my character can choose from. And then you just simply drag and drop that onto your character sheet and then remove gold if you happen to have gold in your character's inventory if you're being required to do so. The same thing works with armor. You've got your starting adventuring gear, as well as the various tools and kits that you can start off with, and this is where you're also going to find your musical instruments if you're looking at having a musically inclined character. These tables are highly useful for finding starting equipment as well as other equipment that your character might want to purchase at a local market or general store, but you might notice that magical items are not listed here. You also won't find magical items within this listing either. If you go through and take a look, all of these items are pretty much non-magical in nature. In fact, this is primarily just strictly starting equipment, and that's because the only module that I have loaded is the player's handbook. And accessing those items through this particular items panel is the second method to go through and actually provide and search for items that you might be looking for. It too also has access to something like an items panel for armor, as well as an items panel for weapons. But the difference between this listing and the other listing found within the class listing is that this window and this window are going to combine all of the supplemental modules that you may have loaded. So any items that might fall under the light armor category, medium armor, or heavy armor, it's going to combine all of that from all of your supplement modules and load them in this list. Over time, if your Dungeon Master has acquired a large number of modules and you've gone ahead and loaded all of those modules, you will find that this page listing is going to get quite large. And you can go ahead and actually search for a particular item just simply by searching through this, as well as once magical items are actually listed within this listing because, say, the Dungeon Master's Guide is now loaded, then you'll be able to find all of that stuff here. You can also narrow it down by category. So if you don't want to necessarily look for a sword, but you want to narrow it down to the type of weapons, then all you have to do is go ahead and just simply click this, and it will just show you nothing but weapons. The final elements that the player's handbook provides to you as a player are the skills, images, and tables listings that are part of the printed book. All 3 panels list all of the elements within their respective categories, so that skills would be a complete listing of all of the skills that your character can make use of, while images and table listings are those for showcasing the various images and rollable tables that you can find within the book. However, they are all primarily there mainly for informational purposes, as they are usually linked to from other areas within the interface, such as the character's class sheet, or in relation to your character's information sheet, your character sheet itself, things like that. If I take a look at Bluebell here, you will see that all of our skills that we see here are listed right here on our actual character sheet. So we don't really have to go to this particular skills panel to see the information associated with a particular skill. As such, I'm simply providing these and pointing them out to you for familiarization reasons, so that you know where to look if you do need to go look something up and you have to do it through these listings. In summary, the player's handbook is really meant to supply a player with all of their rules, information, items, and details needed to create and play a role-playing game as a character in a world of the Dungeon Master's making. The module sufficiently does that in droves, and through Fantasy Grounds, it is able to present it to you in bite-sized elements that allow you for quick references, automation, and a certain amount of customization, such as your themes, things like that. I want to thank you for watching this video on behalf of Smiteworks and myself. I also want to thank Smiteworks for providing me the opportunity to present this information on their channel, and look forward to continuing with our collaboration. Please click on the like button if you found the information in this video useful to helping you learn how to use Fantasy Grounds Unity in relation to the player's handbook, and consider subscribing to the Smiteworks Fantasy Grounds YouTube channel to keep up to date with new content as it is released. If you have questions or comments about this video, feel free to post them in the comment section of the video below for others to be able to see and contribute to the discussion.